To understand what Dean Martin did in June 1962, you need to understand who Marilyn Monroe was at that moment in her life. She wasn't the glamorous movie star the world imagined. She was a 36-year-old woman fighting for survival in an industry that had chewed her up and was ready to spit her out. Marilyn had been struggling with insomnia, depression, and addiction to prescription pills. Her personal life was in shambles. Her marriage to Arthur Miller had ended. Her affair with President Kennedy was over. She was alone, vulnerable, and desperately trying to hold on to the one thing she had left, her career. Something's Got to Give was supposed to be her comeback. A romantic comedy directed by George Cukor, co-starring Dean Martin. It was a big-budget Fox production, and if it succeeded, Marilyn would prove to Hollywood that she still had what it took. But from the first day of production, things went wrong. Marilyn was late to the set, sometimes hours late. Sometimes she didn't show up at all. When she did arrive, she seemed disoriented, confused, unable to remember her lines. The studio executives watched the dailies and panicked. They were hemorrhaging money. Every day Marilyn didn't work cost them $50,000. The other actors and crew members were being paid to sit around and wait. Dean Martin watched all of this with growing concern. He'd known Marilyn for years. They'd never been close friends, but they respected each other. Dean understood what Hollywood did to people, especially to women like Marilyn, who were treated as commodities rather than human beings. Unlike most of his co-stars who complained about Marilyn's behavior, Dean saw what was really happening. Marilyn wasn't being difficult on purpose. She was sick, really sick, and instead of helping her, the studio was using her illness as an excuse to get rid of her. On the set, Dean was the only one who showed Marilyn genuine kindness. When she'd forget her lines, he'd make a joke about forgetting his own, taking the pressure off her. When she'd arrive late, he'd tell the crew it was worth the wait. When she'd break down crying in her dressing room, he'd sit with her, not saying much, just being present. George Cukor, the director, later said that Dean Martin's patience with Marilyn was remarkable. Most leading men would have demanded her removal, but Dean seemed to understand something that nobody else did. Marilyn Monroe wasn't the problem. The system that created her was the problem. The studio executives didn't see it that way. To them, Marilyn was a liability, a has-been who couldn't deliver. They'd been looking for an excuse to fire her, and on June 8, 1962, they found it. Marilyn had missed several days of shooting to fly to New York and sing Happy Birthday to President Kennedy at Madison Square Garden. The performance became legendary, but to Fox executives, it was the final straw. She'd chosen a political event over their movie. That was unforgivable. The studio fired Marilyn Monroe from Something's Got to Give and immediately began legal proceedings to sue her for breach of contract. They were demanding $500,000 in damages, an astronomical sum that would have bankrupted Marilyn. The executives were gleeful. They'd gotten rid of the problem and found a scapegoat to blame for the production's failures. They called Lee Remick's agent. Lee was young, beautiful, reliable, and most importantly, she wasn't Marilyn Monroe. She'd do exactly what she was told. The contracts were drawn up. Production would resume in 2 weeks with Lee Remick as the female lead. Everything was settled, except Dean Martin hadn't been consulted. The studio assumed Dean would be fine with the change. After all, he was a professional. He'd work with whoever they gave him. They were wrong. When Dean heard that Marilyn had been fired, he was in his dressing room preparing for a scene that would never be filmed. His manager, Herman Citron, came in with the news. "Dean, I need to tell you something. Fox fired Marilyn this morning. They're bringing in Lee Remick to replace her." Dean stopped what he was doing and turned to face Herman. "What did you just say?" "They fired Marilyn. The studio says she's been too unreliable. They're moving forward with Lee Remick. When do they plan to tell me this? They assumed you'd be okay with it. They're announcing it to the press this afternoon." Dean's face went hard. His usual laid-back demeanor evaporated, replaced by something Herman had rarely seen: pure anger. "Get me a meeting with the executives, now." Herman tried to talk him down. "Dean, you can't fight to this. Marilyn violated her contract. Fox has every right to replace her. Get me the meeting, Herman, or I'll walk into that boardroom myself and say what needs to be said." 2 hours later, Dean Martin sat across from Peter Levathes, the head of production at 20th Century Fox, and 3 other studio executives. The atmosphere in the room was tense. The executives had heard that Dean wanted to discuss the Marilyn situation, and they'd prepared their arguments. Dean didn't give them a chance to start. "I'm here to tell you that if Marilyn Monroe is not the female lead and Something's Got to Give, then I'm not the male lead." Levathes smiled condescendingly. "Dean, I understand you're loyal to Marilyn, but this is a business decision. She's cost us over $2 million. We can't afford to keep her. Then you can't afford to keep me either." The smile disappeared from Levathes's face. "You have a contract. I have a contract that says I'm making a movie with Marilyn Monroe. That's what I signed on for. If you want to make a movie with Lee Remick, get yourself another leading man." One of the other executives, a lawyer named David Brown, spoke up. "Martin, if you walk away from this production, we'll sue you for breach of contract." "Sue me," Dean said calmly. "I'd rather go to court than betray someone who's being treated like garbage." The room went silent. Nobody had expected this. Dean Martin wasn't known for being difficult. He was the easygoing guy, the professional who showed up, did his job, and went home. But here he was, threatening to destroy his own career for a woman most people in Hollywood had written off. George Cukor was called into the meeting. The director had been waiting outside, and when he entered and heard what was happening, his face went pale. "Dean," he said quietly, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you need to think about this. If you walk away, they'll never hire you again. I've thought about it, George. I've thought about it a lot. And I can't be part of this. Marilyn is sick. She needs help, not a lawsuit. She needs compassion, not punishment. And if this studio can't see that, then I don't want to work for them." Cukor later told friends that at that moment, he saw something in Dean Martin that he'd never seen before. Not the cool persona, not the casual charm, but genuine moral courage. Dean was willing to sacrifice everything he had built for a principle, for a person who couldn't fight for herself. Levathes tried a different approach. "Dean, we're willing to be reasonable. If you agree to continue with Lee Remick, we'll drop the lawsuit against Marilyn. We'll even pay her what she's owed for the work she's already done." "That's very generous," Dean said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You ruin her career, humiliate her publicly, and then you pay her what she's already earned. You want a medal for that? What do you want, Dean? I want you to unfire Marilyn. Give her another chance. Get her the medical help she needs. Let her finish this movie with dignity." "That's impossible." "Why? Because she's unreliable?" So am I. I show up drunk half the time. But you keep hiring me because I put people in seats. Marilyn does the same thing. The difference is you respect me and you don't respect her." The executives looked at each other, unsure how to respond. Dean stood up. "You have 24 hours to make a decision. Either Marilyn is back on this movie or I'm out. And when I walk, I'm taking this story with me. I'll tell every reporter in Los Angeles exactly why I left. How Fox treated a sick woman like she was disposable. How the studio that claims to care about its stars threw one of the biggest stars in the world away when she needed help the most. That's not a threat, Dean. That's a promise." Dean walked out of the boardroom, leaving the executives in stunned silence. George Cukor followed him into the hallway. "That was insane," Cukor said, but there was admiration in his voice. "I know," Dean replied, "but sometimes insane is the only sane response." The next 24 hours were chaos. The studio executives held emergency meetings. The legal department analyzed Dean's contract, looking for loopholes. The publicity department prepared damage control strategies. And Marilyn Monroe, who had been at home sedated and unaware of what was happening, was told by her lawyer that Dean Martin had just put his entire career on the line for her. She broke down crying. Later, she told her friend and makeup artist Alan Whitey Snyder, "Nobody has ever done anything like that for me. Nobody." The studio's decision came down exactly 24 hours later. They called Dean's manager and delivered the news. Fox was reinstating Marilyn Monroe. They were giving her one more chance. Production would resume in 3 weeks, giving Marilyn time to get healthy. But the decision came with conditions. Marilyn would have to submit to daily medical examinations. She'd have to prove she was fit to work. And if she missed even one day of shooting without a doctor's note, she'd be fired immediately, and Dean's contract would be voided. Dean accepted the terms. He called Marilyn personally to tell her the news. "Marilyn, it's Dean. You're back on the picture." Marilyn was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Why did you do that, Dean? Why did you risk everything for me?" "Because somebody had to," Dean said simply, "and because you're worth fighting for. They never got to make the movie together." 6 weeks later, on August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home. The official cause was acute barbiturate poisoning, ruled a probable suicide. She was 36 years old. Dean Martin was devastated. He'd fought for her, given her a chance, and it hadn't been enough. Nothing had been enough. At Marilyn's funeral, Dean stood in the back, away from the cameras and the crowds. He didn't want to be seen. He didn't want to be part of the spectacle. He was there to say goodbye to a woman he'd tried to save and failed. Years later, when asked about Marilyn and Something's Got to Give, Dean would get quiet. His usual jovial demeanor would disappear. He'd say, "She deserved better than what Hollywood gave her. We all failed her. But at least I tried. I stood up when everyone else sat down. That's all I could do." George Cukor, who witnessed Dean's stand against the studio, said in a 1975 interview, "In 40 years of making movies, I saw a lot of brave things. Actors risking their lives for stunts. Directors fighting for their vision. But what Dean Martin did for Marilyn Monroe was the bravest thing I ever saw. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and he did it anyway. That's not just courage, that's character. The story of Dean Martin's fight for Marilyn Monroe didn't become widely known until years after both of them had died. Dean never publicized it. He never used it to make himself look good. It was just something he did because it was right. In the end, Something's Got to Give was never completed. The footage that exists shows Marilyn in her final role, beautiful and vulnerable and heartbreakingly fragile. And it shows Dean Martin being what he always was beneath the cool exterior, a decent man who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That's the real legacy of Dean Martin. Not the songs, not the movies, not the Rat Pack legend, but the moments when he chose compassion over career, when he chose principle over profit, when he looked at someone the world had discarded and said, "Not on my watch." Marilyn Monroe died believing that at least one person in Hollywood had fought for her. One person had seen her as a human being, not a commodity. One person had risked everything to give her another chance. That person was Dean Martin, and George Cukor was right. It was insane. It was also one of the most beautiful things anyone in Hollywood had ever done.